And joining us today, we've got David Maywald, all the way from Canberra in Australia. And what a topic we have today. David, how the devil are you?
Doing pretty well, mate. And
Good.
it's good to be here and chatting with you.
Thank you for coming on as a guest. And the topic of today is masculinity and the war on masculinity. And you've just written a book on that very subject, which I've been listening to. You were very kind to send me the audio, which I've nearly finished. But before we get into that amazing topic, let's just give us a quick rundown of what you're up to and how you got to writing this book.
Well, I'm a father and a board member on a couple of charities here in Canberra. And I've had a passionate interest in boys' education for about 30 years. And during my career as a financial analyst and researcher, I obviously honed all of those skills with quantitative and qualitative research. And that's what I've really brought to bear in this book, The Relentless War on Masculinity. So I've looked at the data, I've combined that with case studies and anecdotes and a whole bunch of analysis, qualitative and quantitative analysis. And I've put together this thesis around society shifting towards gynocentrism in the West and what I have characterized as a war on masculinity.
All right. So you worked in the finance industry before that and turned your guns on this particular subject. Maybe not a great phrase to use in that respect, but where can people find your book? Any socials you want to publicize it right from the outset?
Yeah, I do have a presence on social media under my name, David Maywald. And I've also got a branding that I use called Celebrating Masculinity, which is on Facebook, LinkedIn, X, and Substack. And you can subscribe for free at Substack. So I send out articles, and many of them recently have obviously been related to the book, drawing from excerpts and expanding and making it relevant to readers.
And you've got a large following. I saw. I joined so I could see everything that's going on, try and stay on top of things. And interesting that these things seem to come around when it's subjects that I find interesting, and then the universe provides me guests to talk about such subjects. And it's not necessarily all about this kind of thing, but just when the right time comes for the right guest, and it just seems to happen just like that. So I have 11-year-old boy, and I have a 5-year-old daughter. So it's an interesting dynamic we live in right now. But as you know, I live in Switzerland, which is, I would say, a bit more traditional than the rest of Europe. So where I live, it's a bit more like I grew up as a kid. There's a lot of freedom because I live in a small village. It's in the middle of the mountains, so there's lots of space, and the kids can go and they can walk to school on their own, and there's no problems. And my boy he'll go off after school, and I won't see him for a couple of hours. I don't know where he is. He hasn't got a phone. I don't put an Apple tag on them, which I think is cruelty for those poor little guys. Because imagine that when you were a kid, if your parents put a tracker on you, you'd have been furious, right?
I would have hated it. I would have ripped it off and thrown it down the toilet.
Put it on a bus or a train and freak your parents out. Well, exactly. That's the whole point. So it's a bit of a minefield, the whole subject. But there's a lot which I've noticed. Well, basically since I was a kid as well, and bearing in mind we're probably around about the same age, that we've seen, like, I guess you would call it the old days and the modern days, and we've seen the changes, and it seems to have gone way too far in one direction. I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, but whatever. Is this why you decided to write this book?
Yeah, well, I've seen exactly that. When I was in high school and university, there were waves of empowerment, scholarships, affirmation for girls and young women. And I could see just how powerful that was. In practice, it was providing them the means and support to do better and go further in education. And when I had a son and a daughter, just like you, I was obviously thinking about the world that they would be living in 10, 20, 30 years' time and the life that they would experience. And, in particular, the dedication in the book, it mentions the boys and young men who are falling through the cracks in education. It mentions the men who aren't being served by a healthcare. So it really speaks to the cohorts of disadvantaged males, particularly when you look in terms of income, education, vulnerable families, Indigenous groups. It specifically speaks to them. And I think it's a bit easy in the upper middle class and in the elites to completely gloss over the disparities that are faced by boys and young men and by older men, middle-aged men, some of whom are completely disengaged from the labour market, some of whom are broken by very physical work and careers. I think they often get ignored, and male disposability is a feature of every society around the world and through humanity. And it's very easy for the elites in media and politics and business to forget about the men who've really fallen behind.
Mm. One of the things I've noticed lately is there's much more in the way of there's many more female teachers than there are male, and not that that's a bad thing. I'm glad that they actually want to teach. And incidentally, in Switzerland, the teachers get paid very well, but there isn't very many men compared to when I was a kid. It was probably about half and half, and now it's, I don't know what it is, probably 80-90% the other way around. And I've often thought that it's always a good thing to get the perspective from both of the sexes when you're getting taught, and not necessarily that your physics teacher was a man and your English teacher was a woman, based on those kind of old biases. But that's what I think is lacking a lot nowadays, is that you're not getting balance in the teaching.
Yeah, I completely agree. In Australia, primary schools have 82% female teachers, and it's an all-time high for females and all-time low for males. I mean, for my son and daughter, we are hugely grateful that they have quite a few male teachers and also male administrators who are there looking at behavior management in the class and in the playground. And it's really powerful to have both the female perspective and the male perspective. I think we just pick up different things. Male and female communication and engagement, it's different. Strengths and traits tend to be clustered. Of course, they overlap in the middle. You have some girls who do fantastically in maths. You have some boys who do fantastically in drama and English. But I'll give you a personal example. I had some very good female teachers, particularly ones that I recall in high school, in chemistry, for example. But most of the really inspiring teachers during my schooling years were male teachers and male administrators or a male principal. And those are the ones who really turbocharged and pushed me and related to what I was curious about, and had a huge influence. And one of the things about writing my first book at the age of 49 is I never really lit a spark in English at school. I never had an inspiring male teacher. And so I didn't feel a connection. I didn't feel motivated and a real desire to push myself in English and reading and writing. It was only in my late 20s that I really discovered reading for pleasure and really started reading widely, which has helped, obviously, for the basis of writing a book, having read so widely, especially across male authors and writing on men and boys.
Yeah. I guess it's because if you're a male teaching male children, you can relate more to what interests the young boys and young men when they're being educated. It's what things that you like to read. For instance, I like to read as a kid. A lot of adventure and history and swashbuckling tales and that kind of stuff. That kind of thing, which is still actually lights me up to this day, but a bit less so. And I guess that's probably the reason, isn't it, that you remember these things. Yeah, it's an interesting one. When I was at school, so I was basically at school. We were at school when things started to change noticeably. I guess in the sort of late 80s. This is, God, this is how it worked. And in Scotland, certainly where I grew up, they had the exam change. They changed the exams. What's the word I'm looking for? How they assess. So they changed the curriculum slightly so that there was much more. So you had to write essays and like projects and things like that, which I'll be honest with you, I was never very good at. I'm not very good at sitting down and writing essays. In fact, I hate them. I've done them many, many times, but it's horrible. And before they say it was skewed towards males because, like, for instance, I didn't have to study very much and got pretty decent marks, and I was good at getting enough information in my head for the exam, basically. And, maybe discard that a bit later on, but I was good at doing that. And that all changed and my marks went down considerably. And the girls' marks went up considerably higher. And I'm not saying that it's across the board, right? For instance, I'm it's very, very smart girls in my class at school, of course. But yeah, that all changed. And then, so it became a bit harder for guys to get into university. And that's now been reflected in university admissions throughout the Western world.
That's right. And it's quite unbalanced. For example, in Australia, female graduates are 64% higher than male graduates coming out of university. And those numbers continue to go in one direction. So in the English-speaking countries and for across quite a few of the Western countries, it's heading towards 2-1. Eventually we'll get to the point where there are twice as many female graduates as male graduates, which is quite unhealthy. That's even more extreme than the pro-male balance of universities going back several decades.
It's funny, the next podcast guest, well, he's coming on after the holidays are finished. And he is also a finance guy, hedge fund guy, who's making a big drive towards, it's slightly, I suppose it's connected, but it's, well, quite strongly connected, I think. But he's very strong on apprenticeships and being able to, I think it was, pretty sure it was Plato, or it could have been Socrates, one of these old Greek guys anyway, who said that it's best for guys to learn a trade from a master and then think about further education. So when instead of going straight to university, maybe learn something from a master, learn how to learn in a way, and then you can consider going for university. Because my wife is pretty much diametrically opposed to what I'm saying here, but like he's saying now, he's just like, what can I do? What can I make money like straight off the bat? And I said, well, electrician. You got to look at the future here, and you can see this enormous need for power generation because of these AI data centers, and they're plugging them in next door to nuclear reactors, building new nuclear reactors just to feed the power necessary for these things. And was it Mark? I think it was Mark Andreessen was saying it, one of these podcasts. So he's one of the Facebook early investors, or he's a tech investor anyway. And he said there's going to be like a massive shortfall of electricians in the very near future. In fact, this probably is now, in fact. And, it's just, why don't you do something like this? Go and learn a trade. You've always got something to fall back on, in future. I mean, it's a lot of uncertainty as to what's going on, but I think it's going to be quite hard for a robot to be an electrician, on a building site or on a hydroelectric power. There's a lot of hydro here, and they're building these hydro dams, and there's a lot of electrical engineering and electrical expertise required. So there's a bit. It seems like there's, like anything, like whenever you get to an extreme, the pendulum always swings back the other way. And I can see, such as what you're doing now, and this other gentleman is that the pendulum has certainly got to a point where, well, even Elon Musk is saying you don't have to go. What's the point of going to university anymore?
Yeah.
You're going to learn better on the job if you're smart enough or whatever. You've got the necessary skills for the job. Then there's no real point in going to university.
Mm. Yeah, well, the technology and the labour market has changed, and you've seen that in terms of hiring for graduates and the demand for some of those university courses. I recently wrote an article for the Australian, the national newspaper, about education for boys and young men, and one of the consistent things that came back through the comments, and there were hundreds of comments. It was a very positive reception to the op-ed. Consistently from the older readers, particularly the grandparents, have watched their kids and their grandkids grow up. They consistently made comments about how closing down the technical high schools was one of the worst things that ever happened in the Australian education system because it was meeting a need. You've got differences in cognitive development between boys and girls when they go through adolescence and teenage years. And you tend to see that the prefrontal cortex develops later in boys than it does in girls. And that boys don't necessarily have the same application or discipline to see through the next few years. And they tend to prefer working with their hands and building things and making things and earning as they're learning. So like you're saying, electricians, other trades, they can be a really good option. In fact, It makes me think about when I was in finance for 20 years, I came across a number of businessmen and financial executives who were just sort of finding their way in their early 20s. They didn't necessarily finish university or even go to university. They found their feet at some stage during their 20s, got good, applied themselves, developed their marketing, communications, worked out how to make money out of a business. And then they went back and did masters, or they did some studies, and they really accelerated and took their profession to the next level, because I think they're probably fully mature by that stage. Late 20s, 30s, they'd found what they were good at. They understood, more about themselves. They had the patience and the discipline, and they could invest in themselves on a multi-year horizon, which often is quite hard for a teenage boy, even for young men in their early 20s. They don't necessarily have that consistency of application that maybe the girls and young women of the same age have to a slightly better extent.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because I can't change, honestly, I can't change anything about my past. But one thing I look back on and think, there was a lot of lost years, which would have been probably because I like everyone else, you get the marks necessarily to go to university. And therefore, you just, I'll go to university. What do you study? I don't know. How do you compete? What engineering or whatever, computing science in my case. And I had no interest in it whatsoever, none. And that led to some dark years. But it actually added fuel to the fire, and I actually ended up having to pull my socks up and make something of my life. Otherwise, who knows where it could have ended up. But that's why I'm thinking that, if you're not sure about this is what I say to our son. I say, if you're not sure what you want to do, pick a trade, get a trade. Doesn't matter where you live in the world. There's always going to be a need for electricians or plumbers or whatever it's going to be. Skilled labor. And the money they make is pretty damn good, I've got to say. I mean, compared to the national average salary, it's I've renovated a couple of houses and I know how much it bloody costs for an electrician. And it's absolutely ridiculous. It doesn't seem that hard either.
You're spot on, Nicole. I had the same experience in university. I changed courses a couple of times and was pretty lost. And then was just fortunate to fall into commerce and economics, which was just a good fit for the capability that I had. In Australia, it's a real benefit to have tradies in your family. To have an electrician, a carpenter, to have a plumber in your family, because they're earning such good money and they're hard to get hold of sometimes. There's a great demand in infrastructure, residential and other construction, renovations, maintenance, all those sorts of things. hugely in demand, and it's something that you can fall back on as well. Once you've nailed it and got some experience, then it's something, if you're between jobs or have some time you need to make some money, it can be something that's really valuable to fall back on.
Yeah. Yes. I thought of something quite amusing when you were talking there, is having like school friends and family friends who are tradesmen. We used to call it a homer in Scotland. So it's basically when you've got time in between jobs, come round, and it was a few bucks cash in the back pocket for something that they can fix in like an hour. It would take me all day for sure, and it would probably get wrong and have to call the tradie in anyway. But that's just the way it is. But it brings me on a little bit to what I've been trying to formulate an idea in my head, and I've spoken to quite a few of the guests about this as well. Specifically, guys, like in my case in the army, was mentorship, to have a mentor. And so I had a 3-star general came on, an old friend of mine from the army, and we talked about this after. We're going to do a podcast about it in the future, and how important it is to have someone giving you a little nudge in the right direction and say, maybe you want to stop a little bit less of this and a bit more of that. Just a friendly word in the ear. And, when you're stuck, if you're making mistakes and you just need some help. And because as you go through any job, you've made all the mistakes and you can tell people how to avoid them. So what's your view on mentorship?
Oh, it's crucial. It's underutilized. I think particularly in this age, when levels of fatherlessness and broken families are at the levels they're at in the West and Anglo countries, and also, as we were talking about, the dearth of male teachers, male early educators, but in general as well, the media, culture, government, all the signalling has been for men to go onto the back foot, to step out of the public square, to be quiet, don't listen to them. And unfortunately, what that's done is it's pushed men out of leadership roles, out of mentorship roles, out of coaching, out of being involved in the lives of boys and teenagers and young men. And that's really terrible. I mean, in the book, I write quite a lot about the challenges of boys transitioning from teenagehood into manhood. And, I go right back to traditional societies, to religion, to rites of passage. And what's crucial at that time is that their father's there, their biological father is actively involved, but there's also a group of loving elder men who are around them to catch them if they fall and to pick them up and to be a friendly shoulder or face to speak with. They don't always want to talk to their dad. And certainly they don't always want to talk to their mum. It helps to have, whether it's an uncle or a coach or a male teacher or other loving elder men, experienced men who are available to them to have a conversation, to unburden things that they don't necessarily want to talk with to their family, and to pick them up when they inevitably fall. We've crucified young males for failing, and they've been set up for failure. And unfortunately, the lack of male mentors, coaches, teachers, fathers being disengaged from families, it's a perfect storm for boys not having an adequate transition to manhood.
I was thinking in what is part of trying to get my head around how to help with this lack of mentors is we're looking at really retired guys who've done a whole career and they've made every single mistake. And as you know, as you get older, you think like by the time you're 30 that you're gonna know everything. But no, it doesn't work like that at all. You're still constantly learning. I think it's a lifelong thing. But somebody who's maybe worked in industry for, say, 40, 50 years and made a success, or maybe not even necessarily all that successful, it doesn't have to be, but to be a sounding board, or if you need a bit of help. That was my view. I don't know what kind of strategy have you got for this?
So there are some nonprofits in Australia that try to step in for those roles. And think about Big Brother, Big Sister. It's like a formalized version of mentorship, right? So what they have correctly identified the problem. They've identified the problem that there are many boys and teenage boys and young men who don't have sufficient guidance, connection to elder males. But the challenge is they're trying to apply a formal response to that. And young, boys, teenage boys, they don't always respond in that formal setting. So you might set up a monthly catch up between a fantastic guy and a teenage boy who is really in need. But if they're only catching up for an hour a month, that's probably not going to meet all their needs. And what's more important is that we have the community around children, boys, teenagers available at the times that they need. And that's why sporting teams can be so powerful. You might train once or twice a week or might have a game once a week. So you have this regular opportunity to chat with your coach or to chat with one of the other fathers who's involved, might have a son in the team. For example, being in a religious community and being at church once a week regularly, where there's obviously older groups of people, fathers, families, who, like me and you, have seen a few years and made some mistakes and have reflected on them and thought about how we could have done things differently. So I don't emphasize so much the formal mentorship and governments throwing money at nonprofits to try and respond to this. What I think is much more important is fathers remaining actively involved, biological fathers being actively involved in their children's lives, intact relationships, and the constant wraparound of being available when the boys and teenage boys and young men really need it. And that might not be the once a month catch up.
Yeah, I agree. And we also have a pretty, I don't know if the tide is turning. I'm not sure. I haven't seen the stats. You're obviously the stat guy. But do you think that the divorce rates have peaked, or is it just as bad as it is currently, as it was in the last sort of 10, 15 years?
So both marriage rates and divorce rates have been trending downwards. There is some interesting stats coming out of the US where the proportion of children living in an intact family has slightly increased over the last 4 or 5 years, which I see as being a really positive indicator, and something that hopefully will benefit those children through their whole lives. At the same time, we obviously know that birth rates are falling. So the proportion of men and women who are going to be childless through their lives is increasing. In some countries, that's heading towards half of all men and women. So you're ending up with these cohorts of involuntarily childless men and women who have left it too late or haven't coupled up or just haven't found the right person and circumstances, or have such a financial cliff in front of them with house prices and cost of living that they perceive it as being very, overwhelmingly challenging. When I think back to my grandparents, they had pretty small houses. They had a lot of kids living in small houses. They certainly didn't have their own bedroom each. At times there were 2, 3, 4 children living in a room. And for the most part, they grew up pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a shortage of dollars here. I think expectations have become inflated to an unreasonable extent. It's the time and love. I mean, what I think we've probably overweighted is career and financial independence, and we probably haven't given enough attention to parents being really engaged, actively involved. I often see when we go out with our kids, I often see other parents on their phones and not interacting with their own children. I often see kids watching tablets, sitting down at the table as a family lunch or dinner, and thus staring into a screen. And I have to admit, in the last 18 months, it's been our kids who have told me and my wife to get off our phones because I think we're probably addicted to the devices and to social media. And that's really embarrassing and humbling when your own kids point out those, those flaws in that behavior and the habits that we've built up. Thankfully, they're young enough, they're in primary school, that they haven't got addicted to devices and social media and other things yet. And yeah, it is quite humbling to realize that, I probably have.
Oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I guess because I do this, I need to stay on top of what's going on. But yeah, I can easily cut it down by 90%. Easily. You just get sucked in, don't you? You think, God damn it. And it's done on purpose, of course, we all know that. But
yeah, there's a business model behind it. And actually, you'd probably be aware that Australia has recently brought in legislation which has a ban on social media accounts across a whole bunch of platforms for under 16s.
Yeah.
And the really challenging adjustment I can see there is the 13, 14, 15-year-old kids who've been using these things for years and years. And it's just part of what they swim in. It's what they used to. I always thought the biggest change there would be the cultural shift. It would be people talking about the risks and the downsides and the costs of being addicted to smartphones and social media accounts. I never thought that the legislation and the compliance framework would be the big game changer. Kids, if they are addicted, they'll always find ways around it.
I know.
And you found that, there've been these bizarre stories of people using silicone masks and Halloween masks and other things to trick the facial recognition. They're using VPNs and other things like that. There are ways to get around it, the technology, regime that's trying to enforce these age restrictions. I always thought it would be the role modeling, the discussions that were being had. It would be the family interactions, the cultural aspects. I always thought that was going to be more important than any regulation.
Well, for us, okay, we're having a little bit of issues at the moment. And it's not like they don't get screens very often. I mean, they do, but it just had kind of got to the point now where it's like, okay, you got to give me that back. And it's now going to be a reward as opposed to a right for this sort of thing. But I live in it's a great place for kids to grow up. It's an amazing place. There's lots of activities. There's lots of open space and forests and lots of fun things to do outside. And even then, I never know if our boy's going around to his friend's house and they're just going to play video games, which is probably what's happening. But a lot of the time, they're not. They're out doing stuff, and I see them, and that's great. What the big difference I see is I've a big holiday resort right next to where I live, and we've got our kids have friends from like the UK, city dwellers, living in London or wherever, and the difference in behaviors between them is quite stark. And what I notice is some of the kids will want to come down and hang out with our kids, and they'll go and do something outside. And they never really get to walk there on their own, which doesn't really happen in London until you're probably in your teens, I would have thought. I'm using London as an example because I was there recently. But they come here and they love it. They love to be out in the open. They love to be outside and doing like fun stuff as opposed to being inside all the time. And, they're at home with their parents, maybe the parents are on the phone, they've got work and, but they're on holiday, but they're still working, of course. So that's just how it is. So I'd notice there's a big old difference that way. So it's not that bad in our case, but it's, how do they actually enforce that law?
The obligation's been put on the platforms.
Right.
So you
need to have facial recognition to have access.
Some of them are using that. I mean, it's up to them to meet their legal obligations. I've had my face scanned. I mean, the thing is, it's not just obviously checking on the under 16s. They have to satisfy themselves across their whole user base in Australia now. And there are significant fines for non-compliance. So a number of different means are being used by different platforms.
Yeah, that's how they start. They always for the surveillance state, they say it's for security, and then you go, all right, it's for the kids, and then of course it's for everyone, and it's all part of the digital ID push, which we know is they're trying to get done. Yeah, and Switzerland actually just passed a law that cash must remain legal tender in Switzerland, which is good to know. But that doesn't really mean anything. If all the shops say, well, we're not going to take cash anymore. But I don't want to drift off into that subject. I need to get somebody else on for that one to talk about that. But when it comes to the workforce for young men, when I left the army, a good friend of mine was working at the UN in Geneva, and we used to work. He was a civil servant when I was in the army. We were working at the army headquarters together in England, and we hung out. And he was doing, really enjoyed his job at the UN. I said, "Listen, I've been in various conflict zones for the past 9 years. I could bring some, skills and a bit of expertise to, if you need somebody to go across to, South Sudan or whatever it was at the time, and maybe help out." And he said, "Yeah, great idea, but you've got no chance because you're a white male. They're not going to hire you. You're not going to get hired." And I thought, that's that's not fair at all, because I've got a pretty unique skill set that could be of a lot of use, and how in dealing with, warlords and people who mean to, have malice towards you. It's some, I don't want to go down this track too far, because, I'm not going to say the bad guys, because, we're in their country, and this is what you do in our country. I get that, I'm wise enough now to realize that there's two sides to the story. So, but for me, it was a real wake up call, and to say that you doesn't matter what your skills are, you're not going to get hired based on your gender and your color of your skin. Now, isn't that something?
Yeah, I was having a conversation with with an ex-federal minister from Australia last week, and he said there's a real irony that going back to the 80s, there was a lot of talk about gender neutrality, about color blindness, about not seeing those things, and now we've become indoctrinated to see them almost in hypercolor. They've been exaggerated. So the affirmative action and the DEI frameworks, which have accelerated some groups at the expense of others, really went into turbo drive. And you saw that in the US a few years ago in terms of college admissions. And they weren't always for the better. For example, if you're pushing some underperforming students into high performing groups of students, whether it's in medicine or law or other areas, unfortunately, some of those slightly underperforming students just aren't going to be able to keep up, because they haven't had the preparation, and they haven't been working in an environment with really switched on, really not just hardworking, but talented.
Competitive.
Really competitive areas. And unfortunately, the dropout rates of some of those cohorts of accelerated students were really high, and they would have been better off just going to a college that had a group of students with a similar capability and aptitude and competitiveness to them, instead of putting them into roles that they probably weren't ready for. It's interesting in the UK that one of the groups that is least likely to go to university is poor white boys.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? They're not the top of the heap.
No.
They're not privileged. They're not, benefiting from any patriarchy. And across a number of English-speaking countries now, women in their 20s are out-earning men in their 20s on a per-hour basis. Plus, they're also getting a lot of flexibility in their roles. We have this absolutely bonkers measure of gender pay gap in Australia, but it doesn't factor in work from home, flexibility, having to travel a long way to your job, and it doesn't factor in the risk and danger of jobs. So in Australia, if you're male, you're 20 times more likely to die on the job. But the gender pay gap measure that companies are forced to report, are forced to spend money collecting this data and forced to publicly disclose, It doesn't account for danger or risk, the likelihood of death or injury. It doesn't account for differences in working from home or flexible work. It doesn't account for having to fly several hours, fly in, fly out workers. So it comes up with these completely bogus statistics showing that there's a gap. But what the gap shows is that jobs that are really dangerous pay more. If you have to fly to your work or have to drive a long way to your work, you get paid more. If you don't get to work from home, you get paid for turning up and seeing clients or turning up into the office. That's what the gap measures show. So we've institutionalized this completely bogus non-statistic, and we've forced private businesses to spend shareholders' money collecting and disclosing this data. And it's completely meaningless. But it's ammunition for the feminist to throw through the media every time these bogus statistics get reported.
I had an interesting chat, one of my wife's friends, and she's very well educated, top of her field, and she's, it's quite sad to say, because she's, wanted a family, and, she's single, she hasn't got any children, and, the career took, her 20s and 30s were stolen by her job. As you could put it that way. It might sound a bit harsh, but, and it was the push was that you can have it all. You can have it all. You can have the great job, you can have the great career, and all that stuff that was pushed very heavily when I was, in my sort of 20s, 30s. And they were using, as an example, I can't remember her name, but she was the boss of one of the big hedge funds or investment funds. And she had 4 kids, and she was the superwoman. But I think she had like 3 nannies. She could afford it to have 3 nannies. But that's why I'm wondering this is one of the indicators for me that the pendulum is starting to swing back to hopefully some balance, and hopefully it doesn't go the other way again. In that it's, I would argue that family life is much more important than your career. And you actually said that before, spending the time with your family and prioritizing what is going to be very beneficial long term is, I didn't get married till I was 40. Let's put it that way, and I'm very glad I did. And then I had children late, and like I guess you did as well, way too late.
Yeah.
I should have done this a long time ago, but I'm there, right? And you think you don't have the energy to deal with this energetic kids, but your body always adapts, right? And you can always keep it going. And it's like my mum had my eldest brother when she was 16 or 17 or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah. And then my elder brother came along 18 months after that, and then me when she was 23. And you tell that to people, and like I see, our babysitters coming in who are 16 years old, and you think, God, they're married and had kids at your age.
Yeah.
When I was a kid. That, I can you see that coming back? I suppose you can. I suppose you could really. These things do. If we have a declining birth rate, and there's only the real thing you can do about it is because people can't afford to get married and have kids till they're older nowadays, before you got a bit of stability. And there has to be some sort of program put in place. It's just basically lower taxes if you've got a family, and you get benefits for every kid you have. That would be beneficial, something along those lines. But I don't like government getting involved as much as possible. Just cut the taxes. Cut them back.
So Hungary is
more money.
Yeah, it's an interesting example. In Australia, we had a baby bonus about 20 years ago, which was pretty much a one-off cash payment. But Hungary is a really interesting example. They have a whole suite of measures in Hungary. Some of them are lower taxes. Some of them are concessional finance for housing. There are other financial, economic aspects. But they've also tackled the cultural aspects too, of raising the status of motherhood and specifically overtly speaking to families and parents as being key social institutions and aspects of sustainability of their culture. If you think about the fundamental measures or metrics of a successful society. If you're not self-replicating, that's a pretty basic fundamental aspect of whether you will exist and whether you are meeting the needs of future generations. And what I talk about in the book really is the implications of girls and women being directed into focusing on very high levels of education and careers and financial independence above other priorities and getting out of kilter, having such an emphasis on personal financial independence and high education and career success and fulfillment. And it has come at the expense of other areas, whether it's happiness and life satisfaction, whether it's relationships, whether it's families, whether it's, something more like a long legacy. Because your boss is not going to turn up at your funeral. They're not going to be at your bedside. They are not going to be caring for you in your old age. They won't give a shit. They're not going to be there. Your family and your lifelong friends are the ones who are going to be there in the decades to come. And I think the narratives that we've been telling and the biases that we have been indoctrinating into young people have been part of the lower birth rates. It's been part of the perception that you can't afford to have kids, that it's too hard, that it's not worth doing. Also, declining faith and organized religion. I mean, that was a stabilizing aspect of society that buttressed families, that had the village, it had the community around families. It's really hard. It's always been hard to raise kids, especially if you had 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 or 10. So they always needed that support structure around them. And the atomization of our societies towards individual, short-term, selfish financial perspectives, that has really taken young people away from ideas about sacrifice, about giving to the next generation, about intergenerational relationships and equity. And I think that's been really at the detriment of the sustainability of our societies.
I should actually point out, in case I'm coming across as being, anti anything, which I'm really not, but I was a stay-at-home dad for 8 years. And so one of the interesting things about that is you end up spending a lot of time with other mums at the park and what have you, and you get chatting and talk about things. And I was talking to one. This is quite I like this. This is a good one. You talk about what cartoons your kids like to watch, and I thought, okay, I mentioned something about Peppa Pig. She goes, I don't let my daughters watch Peppa Pig. And I said, okay, why? She goes, oh, because they make the daddy pig out to be a buffoon, a moron, and it's a terrible role model. And I don't want my daughters growing up to think that their father is anything except their father. They don't get any preconceptions about he can be mocked and he always does silly things. And I thought, wow, I did not expect to have that response, but there you go. But that's something you're talking about as well, right?
Yeah, well, the third chapter of my book is called The Four Horsewomen of Modern Feminism. And it talks about misandry, gamma bias, gynocentrism, and gaslighting. And you can run media articles through that framework. You can run cartoons and movies and popular media and entertainment through that framework. In fact, there was a very noteworthy series of books on misandry by...
What's misandry?
Misandry is it's hatred and contempt of males as a class, of all men.
So the opposite of misogyny.
Yeah, that's right. It's the opposite of misogyny. For example, having just talking about in conversation, kill all men, or all men are,
rapists.
Yeah, exactly.
That was one of my favorites. All men are rapists.
Yeah,
it's
the
true.
Blatant stereotypes. It's the blanket hatred. It's the blanket contempt of men as a class. And there was some very notable, a series of books on misandry that were written by Nathanson and Young 25 years ago. And one of the things they did was they looked at the media and entertainment in the 1990s, and they came out with all of these examples of blatant stereotypes and typecasting males as a class as being deficient and buffoons and incompetent. This has been in our media and entertainment for 30 years. They pointed it out in the early 2000s. They're on the record 25 years ago of pointing this out, and it continued. And in some cases, it got a lot worse in the last 10 years. And that's what switched a lot of males off. For example, men are much less likely to be reading mainstream media now. The box office numbers from males watching Hollywood movies during that 10 years or so of DEI and woke Hollywood were atrocious. And when we started to see a handful of movies that had anything barely, positive to say about masculinity and men, they started to get really good box offices again. It's not a surprise. When you dump on half of your potential audience, they'll switch off.
Yeah, exactly. And that's basic economics. I remember in the 80s, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger. These were the role models: Sylvester Stallone, Kurt Russell, Sean Connery. These like hyper masculine movies, and very violent. But yeah, we used to love going to Indiana Jones. We used to love going to watch these movies. I haven't been to the cinema. The last thing I saw in the cinema actually was, I think, The Revenant.
Right.
Which isn't really. That's not really the sort of typical action film, but it was certainly a good film.
So what I've done with my son, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say I really liked it. My wife was like, "Oh, that was too violent. It was too horrible." I was like, "Okay, fine," but each to their own. I just thought I think that's the last film I saw in the cinema.
Right.
It's crazy, isn't it? That was years ago. It was like 10 years ago.
I do weekly movie reviews, but I go right back, to the 90s, 80s, different eras. And I particularly highlight movies that have really inspiring, positive narratives around boys, male mentors, about manhood, about masculinity in general. There are some great ones from the 80s.
Yeah.
Great stories like Platoon. Wow.
Oof.
What an inspiring story. And some of them have religious connotations to them as well. Not always. But there are some, Steven Spielberg, for example, if you look back through his catalog, he's consistently had more of a strengths-based approach to males and masculinity than a deficits-based approach. And that's the thing that really came out of the decade of woke Hollywood, was the focus on deficits, on criticizing males, on deconstructing masculinity. They overemphasized that. They took it to such an extreme that they turned off half of their audience. And that's why, the books that I read to my son, for example, a lot of them go right back. They're classic books, like Hobbit, Never-Ending Story. They've got really fascinating stories to talk about boys transitioning into young men, the difficult, arduous adventures and journeys that they go on, testing themselves, the male mentors who are wrapped around them, who are watching over them, guiding them, picking them up when they fell down. Fantastic stories. They're timeless stories. And I'm really thankful, actually, that the school library and our local library has a bunch of really affirming, positive and enjoyable literature that he's flocked to. And we've deliberately gone out of our way to find material that he enjoys and that's educational for him.
Yeah. I've been pushing our boy into Robert Louis Stevenson books because they're good. And, a lot of them have got almost all of them have got very strong female characters in them as well. It's not like it's just designed for boys. It's you're learning this, because what I hate is this pitting females against males. I just don't see I don't see any point in it whatsoever. In fact, I've only had one podcast guest cancel on me. We had a chat, like we had a chat beforehand, and we set up the meeting, and she was, I guess you'd describe her as a pretty hard feminist, and I said, I don't remember, you're not really, no one, I don't remember, actively saying to female friends, "Oh, you can't do that job." you won't be good at that job, or trying to close the door on them. It wasn't like that at all. I don't recall that really happening. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. And I'm very pleased that if you want to go and work on an oil rig, go ahead, because I did it and it was bloody horrible. And quite frankly, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. But the pay is good, but it's dangerous. I nearly lost my finger on it. Yeah. But I'm kind of skewing off point again, and I forgot what I was going to say about that. But what are the, because you're a statistician and an analyst, and what are for you the most alarming statistics that you've seen in these days, in our modern days?
Well, I'll give you one example that I often reference in terms of justifying the war on masculinity. And that's across the 5 English-speaking countries, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Each year, 50,000 men and boys commit suicide.
Wow.
And the rate of male suicide in those countries is 3 to 4 times higher than the rate of female suicide. And that's actually high compared to history. So during the 60s and 70s, England, Wales, Australia were often below 2 male to female suicides. Plus, when you look at the non-English speaking countries, there are quite a few around the world that are 2 or less in terms of male suicide as a ratio to female suicide. So it really stands out that this period of disenfranchisement, of denigrating males, of accelerating girls and women through education and work, and the lopsided funding. For example, in Australia, health research, there's 5.4 times more going to women's health research than men's health research. So there's such a lopsidedness in many aspects of government, media, society, funding, even business. I know firms who are only hiring females because they've got a quota. They used to have very heavily male-dominated workforces, and they're not taking in any male graduates because they need to hit their quota. So the one that really stands out is that male suicide, and it's got connections there, drivers there around situational distress and life events like relationship breakdown, alienation from children, financial crises, and other things that really hit, man. So that's the one that I often come back to.
That's horrifying. I know I've got friends whose sons have committed suicide, and they seemed fine, as they say. They always seemed, they didn't. It was a complete shock. There was no indication beforehand. It's horrible. I mean, devastating. You're not supposed to outlive your kids, right? That's that's a real. It's not a curse, but it's probably one of the worst things that I could imagine happening, right? And yeah, a lot of guys too, ex-soldiers, do it as well.
Yeah, and we've got some really interesting data now that's highlighting the cohorts of males who are most likely to commit suicide. It does focus on blue collar and ex-services, construction, trucking, even, new fathers are 7 times more likely to commit suicide than new mothers, according to a Swansea University study that came out earlier this year, which really shocked me. That's a very lopsided ratio. I hadn't seen any references or research that had been done in that area. So we now have quite a granular understanding of the groups of males. One stat that shocked me out of the United States was there has been an increase in children and young people committing suicide in the United States, both male and female. And I got to say, if there's a red flag for any society, one of those red flags is your young people choosing to end their own lives. And the other one that really strikes me is the level of developmental delay, children's mental health, the whole range of risk factors around young people and their development. if there's a red flag out there, your children are not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
They're not getting the home and the schooling that they really need to be in a state that you'd say is developing and on a good track. That's got to be one of your huge red flags if there ever was one for a society. And I've already mentioned declining birth rates. That's another about the sustainability of our societies. I think we need to have these honest conversations, Nicole.
Yeah.
And
I agree.
thankfully, there's been a big shift in the Overton window in the last 12 months or so. I think the US election certainly was a massive catalyst for that. And so now we're starting to have much more balanced, open, non-judgmental conversations where we can share male and female perspectives and where sensible people can come together and try to find better ways of collaborating.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need some good news to finish this one off. It's quite depressing. What do you reckon the solutions are? Practical. We've covered mentorship.
We've touched on some of them. Part of it is pulling away from social media and that polarization. I think we're already seeing that. People's usage of social media is declining. One stat I saw was about 10% over the last 3 years. But also, you're seeing more and more young people who choose not to get on. It's not part of their lives, and they don't get addicted. You're also seeing young people in Gen Z questioning the social narratives and the indoctrination, which is a really fascinating social dynamic. And I think you'll see even more of that in the younger cohorts, because what they're questioning is the things that millennials were programmed to work towards. They haven't necessarily led to better lives, happiness or life satisfaction. And they're also aware of the real range of choices that they have in their lives. So I think, young people, that's the hope for me, that they're switched on. They've had exposure to a lot of different perspectives, and they're skeptical as well because they've had marketing thrown at them from a very young age.
Yeah, the propaganda is very strong.
Yeah. I think they'll distill all the different perspectives and they'll make smarter choices.
Yeah. I had an interesting conversation with my friend's son the other day, 19-year-old. And what he was saying was, frankly, I was pretty shocked in that they're completely and utter rejection of everything that's going on right now. They don't watch the BBC. They don't watch Sky. They're not watching CNN. They're not watching any of these media platforms. They're getting all their stuff from X or social media. But of course, the algorithm sets what you see, right? So if you start yourself, if you watch a video mainly out of curiosity of something that you might find a bit controversial and contradictory to what you might think, or how you see the world, and then you start getting bombarded with similar sort of stuff. So, but they're pretty comprehensive rejection of all of this stuff right now, and he's 19, and he says it's the same in his school. He just left school. All the guys are the same. They said we're not putting up with this anymore. We're not doing it. And I thought that was quite inspiring, but at the same time a little bit scary, because what are they seeing? What are they seeing that's caused this massive swing? And it's all part of the equilibrium. Like I said, the pendulum will swing so far to one direction that it has to go the other way, and that's happening. I mean, that's clearly happened in the last couple of years. It's swinging the other way. I just don't want to see it swinging too far the other way. Do you know what I mean? We know how that turns out.
So I wouldn't recommend my children only consume media from any platform or any channel.
Yeah.
And certainly not the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is the government-funded national broadcaster. Yeah. They are certainly biased and have their own ideology, agenda, preferences. But if you think about the private media, well, they have their advertisers.
I know.
They generally uphold the elites and the institutions that are powerful and provide the money for their funding. So you can't trust any of them.
No.
I think we all know that. You don't depend on just one source. Preferably, you source from a range of different perspectives that hopefully expose you to ideas and alternatives. But then it really is up to everyone. We've got to decide. I mean, we're the ones who vote. AI is not going to vote. It'll still be individuals who vote. So we have to contend with what's the case for and against. What's working? What's the evidence? And we've got to be skeptical consumers of that information. To be honest, I think that there might be a tiny proportion of people who get strongly influenced by some of the content they see. I think most young people are quite sensible. They are exposed to a range of different voices. They know some of them are unhinged. They know some of them are trying to push them with marketing or sell them stuff. They'll learn like every previous generation has learnt. You can't trust any one source. You can't, you shouldn't just listen to one person for tell you what to do. I think they're pretty switched on and smart, worldly wise, more so than 2 generations ago.
Yeah, well, the utter and total rejection of the current political parties was one that I was quite surprised at. It's like, good, finally. I thought it was just me. But I mean, you need some sort of political system. But I mean, what we've been having for the last probably 40 years, it's just been terrible for the average person. The average person I'm talking about here. I mean, things have got better, but that's mainly through technology. But it clearly hasn't got better when you've got a huge amount of suicide and the lack of opportunities that young people have got now. They can't buy a house.
Yeah.
I was lucky. I managed to get one. It wasn't that long ago, but I bought one when it was, less than 6 figures. It's, 50 grand to buy whatever it was to buy a flat, 55 grand to buy a small flat. But that was enough, because then after that, it just got super expensive for some reason.
Yeah.
I don't understand why. But that drawbridge has been drawn up, and realistically looking, what chance do you have? The only chance you really have is to get help from your parents.
Yeah.
And I got help from my parents. They co-signed a mortgage for me because wasn't making enough money, or I didn't have enough assets, and that's pretty much the only way you can do it. And that's another reason for maintaining a family as well, right?
But that's the luxury of life, isn't it? You can't depend on it. It's not equally spread across the population.
No, absolutely. And I was lucky. I was fortunate. But yeah, it's tough. It's tough, and I understand why they reject the current society, because it's fundamentally unfair. And I'm talking about, it's across the board, right? That's not color or race or gender. It's not easy. The jobs aren't for some reason aren't paying very well, and the cost of living is through the roof. And I've got friends who've never worried about money in their life, like starting at the supermarket, considering what they're buying, people who've made, comfortable livings, not rich, not super rich or anything like that, regular people. And even they're questioning how much they're spending in the supermarket right now. How did that happen? I mean, that's just ridiculous, but
so
just
the
stuff
young
goes in the
people
ground,
are our
right?
future. So the young people are, they're starting to vote. There are more and more of them every year. There are fewer and fewer baby boomers, and they will shape our politics and society and economies. They're already shaping the workforce in terms of the types of jobs that they aspire to work for, and values being included in what they hope to, have work provide for them. They'll shape policies and outcomes, and they'll make choices. And unfortunately, the current political parties really speak to elites, to older, wealthy people. Yeah. And they basically buttress and put a moat around wealth. They are a barrier to young people who don't have family wealth. And unfortunately, they're making themselves irrelevant because young people just aren't buying into that. They can see how the economies have been rigged in favor of elites and older people. And they're looking for something different.
Yep. It's good to know. I have hope for the future. I have hope for the youth. Anything else you want? Anything else that you might want to? We can close on as you'd like to finish, and anything you want to, final points you want to get across.
Well, yeah, the one that I really work towards in the book is our societies have to have healthy relationships between men and women. Parents caring for their children, actively involved fathers and mothers, male and female bring different things. Masculine and female and feminine energy, they dance together, they weave together.
Yeah.
They have to work together and collaborate. That's how we get good outcomes for children, society, for future generations.
I agree. And it all sounds so simple. Doesn't it? It makes sense to me, makes sense to you. But yeah, balanced, try and balance it as much as possible, trying to give them the opportunities. And hopefully it'll all work itself out. That's what I'm hoping for anyway. So celebrating masculinity, that's what it's called. I like that name. On your LinkedIn, what do you say, LinkedIn?
Facebook, X, and Substack.
Yeah. And David, what a conversation. I wonder what I'm going to get, if I'm going to get any blowback or hopefully just agreement. We're both very pro-woman. We've both got daughters, both got wives, and mothers and grandmothers and aunts and what have you. So yeah, something has to change though. It's just gone too far. Yeah. And I just want everyone to get a fair shake. That's my philosophy on life. Everyone gets a fair shake. And that's a good way to finish it. So David, thanks very much. It's very interesting. I wonder, do you get blowback? Do you get death threats or anything like that?
There's been a little, but actually I've been pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
Like I said, the Overton window has shifted significantly, and there's a real receptivity at the moment to looking at things from multiple perspectives and being open to the needs of boys and men and how men and women can collaborate. So I think it's been really positive, actually. Please, if you're interested, you can find this everywhere that has books, ebooks, and audiobooks, depending on your taste. Mm-hmm. It's been lovely chatting with you today, Nicole. And,
me too.
We've had a really great conversation.
The Relentless War on Masculinity. What a title. David, thanks, mate. And look, if you ever do any more books, or if you want to come back on and report on some successes, then of course, the door is always open. Get in the hot seat. And thanks for coming on, and thanks for listening. All the best. Bye-bye.